أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Respected sisters, dear brothers, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And thank you for joining us after a too long interruption in our series Life, the Islamic Answer, where we had stopped last time when we met. We were discussing the general theme of the community in Islam, idea of building a community of knowledge, a community of believers coming together around knowledge and its importance and its acquisition and its sharing and its application. And when we talked about the community, we established the importance in the Quran, even though we don't hear about it enough, of understanding that we are responsible for ourselves, for each other, for others, not only as individuals, but also as part of a community. And that community may be small. At a collective level, it could be as simple as our families, for instance, or bigger. And this could become the people we generally live with, our neighborhood, people we generally encounter. And then this grows depending on our circumstances, on our abilities, on our reach in the world, and so on and so forth, until it extends to society in general and beyond. When we talked about the idea of this community, we said that we could stop here, but our religion has given a special importance to people in that community, and some of those people have been mentioned because our religion has emphasized them, or because they happen to be more relevant in our lives. We need to spend a little bit more time discussing those. And so the question to bring all of this together is, who belongs to this community? And we said, of course, there is the learner, there is the teacher, there are those who participate in this general activity of learning and who enable it, even if it's as simple as loving this type of gatherings. We talked then about how everyone has to find, one way or another, a place for themselves, a role for themselves in the community of knowledge. And then we specifically spent a bit of time talking about children belonging to the community of knowledge, families belonging to the community of knowledge, women belonging to the community of knowledge, and then we talked about the intellectual. And we gave a number of reasons why we said this is a very important topic, especially for our communities. And if we understand it correctly, then it will mean we do not build our communities, we do not structure our communities in a random way. We're going to be a little bit more deliberate, a little bit more strategic in planning how we structure our communities, how we manage our communities, depending on the conclusions of this discussion, which unfortunately does not take place enough, around the idea of the role of the intellectual in our community and our community of knowledge specifically. We said the discussion can start because this is not a topic that has been addressed directly in our religion, because the idea of the intellectual is very novel, is very recent. Of course, we can't expect to simply go back in the Holy Quran, for instance, and find the word intellectual with verses in the Quran telling us exactly who the intellectual is and how they are supposed to be, what is their role in the community, in society, in the world. This is a new reality that emerged with time, and so we went back and explored how this idea of the intellectual came up. And we noticed that before it emerged in the Islamic world, it actually emerged in the Islamic world as a result of things that happened initially in the Western world. And so we looked at some of the biggest events that led to the appearance of this figure in the world that we now refer to as the intellectual, that did not exist in this way or in this name before. we can find some traits that existed before, but the role of this intellectual changed dramatically, specifically with the Enlightenment and afterwards, with the advent of modernity. And so we talked about what that means, some of the big events that took place in the West, how the world changed as a result of the Enlightenment and modernity, and what that meant for the roles that existed before. You know, what it meant to be a king, and what it meant to be a priest, and what it meant to be someone who taught others, and what it now means to live in that world, and why there is a need for a new figure to appear, and that was the intellectual. And so we went through a number of thinkers and trying to explain, trying to understand what they have said about this figure of the intellectual. Are they looked at in a positive light or a negative light? And we saw that there are three main themes that came up after we went through a number of thinkers, philosophers, to see what they had to say, especially in the last couple of centuries, about this idea of the intellectual. And we said that the three themes that emerged, first is that of the importance, or understanding the importance, of power structures. And power structures became a new idea that did not exist before, by intellectuals who are looking at how societies are structured and who holds the power. And the reason why we talked about this is because many of the thinkers who talked about the role of the intellectual spent time talking about how the intellectual has a relationship with power structures. The intellectual is either going to enable and enforce and make these existing power structures even bigger and more powerful, or he's going to resist, and he's going to expose, and he's going to side on the side of those who are disadvantaged by these power structures. And who better than the intellectual to identify and to expose power structures, because they are usually abstract, complex, nuanced, and they need more analytical power to be found, identified, and explained to others. The second idea that came out, and this is all from Western thinking about the intellectual, is that the intellectual is not always looked at in a very positive light. We saw many of the thinkers, when they talk about the intellectual, we called it skepticism or criticism. And this is oftentimes in practice. It's not the idea of the intellectual that is problematic. It's that when we look at people who have been labeled as intellectuals, who are supposed to be the intellectuals in real life, oftentimes they have been disappointments, and in a lot of cases we feel like society is giving them a lot of role and prestige, and they call it social capital, a lot of power, but this should come with a certain responsibility, and they do not carry that responsibility well. In fact, sometimes they work against that responsibility. And so we are often told by these thinkers, be very careful who you trust, understand what may be motivating them is not always just knowledge or just virtue or just what is right. There's a lot more going on. As you gain a position of power because of your knowledge, because you are an intellectual and you have the tools of knowledge to analyze it, to expose it, to teach it, to influence others, there's also going to be powers that may benefit from you taking a specific position over another, for instance. The last idea was whether an intellectual should be engaged or not, whether they should be activist or not. And we said this is a question that emerged a lot more in the West, because the West was trying to find a way to become more scientific and more objective. And so should someone who is supposed to be an intellectual also be committed and engaged as an activist in a cause, on a side, taking sides, or should they remain neutral and just describe the situation without ever taking sides? Because once you've taken sides, you've become biased and you lose your real rank as an objective intellectual, looking from the outside in, only describing, never prescribing, never saying, and this is right and this is wrong. Because the moment you do that, you've taken sides, you are engaged, you are biased, and you're subjective. That's the claim, and we saw both sides. We saw a few who say you should remain objective. The majority, however, is you must become engaged, at least the ones we looked at. And we said the one leading the charge in these most recent times is Chomsky, with many intellectuals following in the same type of path, saying that of course the intellectual has a responsibility way beyond the responsibility of a normal citizen of the world, because of what they are exposed to, because of the tools that they have received, because of their position in society. They have a lot more responsibility, and so they must therefore become engaged and an activist, carry that ethical responsibility that comes with being an intellectual. And then we started looking at the Islamic world. And we said the case of the Islamic world is a little bit more complicated, because not only did some of the same or similar incidents affect the Islamic world, but there are other layers in the Islamic world that were completely different. So some of the events that led to the advent of the Enlightenment and modernity do not apply to the Islamic world at all. In the Islamic world, there was no real break, there was no real rebellion against religion. That never happened as it happened in the West, where they say religion cannot be looked at alone. Religion represents the old regime, the old system, the tradition, and it has to be taken together along with the state. All of that has to go down, and we have to replace it with a new regime. So no more religion, and no more state represented by monarchy and kings and queens, and no more scripture, and no more anyone or any other force, entity telling us what to do. Now it's all about the human being, humanism, the human being, the individual, and whatever they want to do, so long as they are not harming others. And we're going to create a new system of values based on rationality and reason. And that's the beginning of the Enlightenment and modernity. So everything that belongs to the past has to be rejected. This never happened in this way in the Islamic world. There was no break, there was no rebellion against the old regime, but the Enlightenment, the values of the Enlightenment and modernity, of course, apply to the Islamic world. And one of the main reasons why is that because they were all colonized. And so whatever is happening in the center in Europe, in the West, is also now going to be exported to the areas where colonization is happening. The same ideas, the same principles, the same values, and more. There is more. Globalization had already started to take place in the world. There's no more a way to be completely secluded from what happens somewhere else in the world. In any case, so we said that the major coup, the major event in the Islamic world was the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which was kind of a wake-up call for many Muslims, but it was not limited to that. We went through a series of events. We explained what happened, World War I, World War II, everything that happened before and after, which led in Islam, in the Islamic world, not as a religion, but as a geographical, political, cultural entity, the Islamic world, to the realization that as a civilization it has fallen. And it has no ability to deal with these enemies, these foreign entities that are imposing things on us, and we do not have a capacity to deal with them. And so this is when the thinkers started to analyze the situation and come up, one, with an explanation, and two, with a solution, which led to a series of movements of reform or revival in Islam. And so we went through many of the figures and what they were presenting, including, for instance, we talked about Rifa' al-Tahtawi, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, Muhammad Abda, Rashid Rida, Sayyid Qutb. You'll remember all of those thinkers. We went through Muhammad Iqbal, Malik bin Nabi, and the last time we met, we also talked about, we're coming more and more recent times, we talked about Muhammad Abd al-Jabari and the thinkers who react to his thought. So George Tarabishi, Adonis, Ali Harb. We talked about Abd al-Wahhab al-Masiri, Hassan Hanafi, Taha Abd al-Rahman, wa al-Hallaq. I don't want to summarize a lot of what we said, but there are starting to be general themes that inshallah are starting to emerge to us as we go through their thinking. Today we want to wrap up our understanding of what the main or most influential thinkers in the Islamic world have said about this idea of the intellectual in the community, keeping in mind that the main driver in the Islamic world is a reaction, or was a reaction to what was happening to the Islamic world from the outside. So it's not in a vacuum. It's not in the absolute that all of these thinkers are talking about the role of the intellectual. They're talking about the role of the intellectual in reaction to something, which is what they consider to be the fall of their civilization. That now we have fallen behind as a civilization to the West. And so many of them, the way they're talking about the intellectual is trying to find a solution to the situation we're in. It's not just, for out of simple intellectual exercise and curiosity that we're thinking, what is an intellectual and what should the intellectual do, or what should they be, or what should their role be? No, there's a real crisis according to many of them, and they're trying to deal with that crisis. And so they're looking at it from different angles, and we saw many of them. We saw how, for instance, some of them push more towards trying to emulate what happened in the West. They said there are factors that led to the West becoming dominant, becoming industrialized, becoming technologically advanced, becoming militarily advanced, scientifically advanced. We're going to identify those factors and we're going to replicate them in the Islamic world. And then the same thing will happen to us. And we will also be advanced. In fact, we have reason to become even more advanced than they are. And then there are those who said, absolutely not. We're never going to mimic and imitate something that we consider to be wrong. Everything that we need is already contained in our heritage, in our tradition, in our history, in our teachings. All we need to do is to go back to our identity, in our roots and our heritage, and we will find all of our answers there. And then we saw that there are those who say, no, the path is somewhere in the middle where we have to mix. We have to follow our heritage, where our heritage tells us follow these types of guidelines. These are the lines in the sand within which you have to play. But within that, we have to also go see, perhaps there are things in the West that they have been able to perfect or master that we can learn from, that we can import and use and apply. And some of them have said, absolutely, we just do that. And some of them went further and said, no, even those things that we bring in, we have to look at them a little bit more closely to see, do we have to adapt them? Do they fit into the general paradigm or system or regime that we have, worldview that we have, or do we have to change those? Right? So we saw all of the kind of different variants of the thinkers and the schools of thought until now. Today, inshallah, we want to wrap it up with the few more thinkers that I think are very much worth kind of keeping in mind, knowing. And of course, all of this is based on many discussions we had one-on-one in small groups. There is a lot of interest in this. And so we're taking a little bit longer to go through these. We've taken longer than originally planned to talk about this topic. But a lot of it, unfortunately, has to do with the fact that these types of thoughts and ideas and theories, even though they have been extremely dominant in the Islamic world, are very seldom discussed or presented or explained. And they have far-reaching consequences on our lives depending on the positions we take. And sometimes in our communities we might think the issues we're dealing with are completely unique to us. They're completely new. We don't know where to start. It's kind of overwhelming. And then the more we study these types of thoughts and ideas and theories and thinkers, the more we see that this is not new. And people have been thinking about this and writing about this and discussing it and arguing over it for decades. And there's perhaps a lot we can learn from that. We don't need to start from scratch. There's maybe a lot that we can recycle and build on to see what applies to us. And the idea, of course, from all of this is that we take it all, bring it back to our own realities as a community. We're not doing this as a theoretical exercise, even though it may look like we're talking about, philosophical ideas. We're doing this, we're being very selective. We're choosing the thinkers who have been the most influential in the Islamic world, who had things to say that were worthy of at least being listened to, that had an impact in the world, and we want to look at those and learn lessons from them. Say, this works, this doesn't. We accept this, we reject that. There are perhaps tens of millions of people who went in one direction and other tens of millions of people who went in another. We have to know what's going on. We have to know the kind of world we live in, the kinds of ideas we're surrounded by. And this is, in fact, I don't want to go too fast here. So as we go through these thinkers, of course, each one of these thinkers deserves many lectures. Of course. If we had another type of series, we would do that. This type of series was not meant to spend time on these thinkers in this way, right? We were focused on the Holy Quran and the Ahadith. But this led us to forcing us to think about our community. If we want to build a community of knowledge, what do we need to know? And when we see that the Quran, Ahlul Bayt are pointing us to something that is a little bit more generic, we need to maybe go look around elsewhere to see what we can bring back. And inshallah, to wrap it up, of course we will come back to the Quran and to Ahlul Bayt, using everything that we have found out in this series, especially in this specific heading or theme, where we're talking about the community of knowledge and the role of the intellectual, to see how it applies. What do we take and what do we reject from all of this? And does it have Quranic roots in Islamic teachings or not? Okay, so the few last thinkers, and after this, inshallah, because there was a lot of requests for this, we'll also perhaps spend one lecture, if all goes well today, inshallah, we'll wrap it up with the thinkers we wanted to cover, and we will spend at least one lecture, hopefully one lecture, talking about some of the major Shia thinkers who need to be also presented under this theme of the role of the intellectual, who have specifically talked, addressed with something serious, substantive, different from all of this, worthy of being studied, explored, thought about, analyzed from the Shia world, the role of the intellectual. So inshallah, this is the next lecture. If all goes well today, then the next lecture we will focus on the Shia thought with regards to the role of the intellectual. If we would spend more time on it on the Shia side, the discussion will have to be a lot more technical. And we don't want the discussion to become technical because it's going to force us to start talking about the role of the intellectual in the, let's call it the fiqh regime or the law regime. What is the role, what is the authority of the knowledge you have when it is non-religious yet specialized expert knowledge? Where does it belong? How does the discussion go, or how does the argumentation go, or the validity of the argument go between the religion or the religious and the non-religious to establish an Islamic position? It becomes very technical, and that's not really our need, right? So we won't go too far in that discussion. But there are things I think that are definitely worth mentioning, so inshallah we'll keep them for the next lecture. The first thinker that we wanted to continue with today, I believe we have maybe 7 of them. The first thinker, Malcolm X. So Malcolm X is not considered to be one of the, major philosophers presenting huge theories that are going to be studied and analyzed. But the way he influenced in his sphere of activity definitely gave a lot of space for the idea of the intellectual on 2 fronts. Even though he didn't talk about it this way, in his teachings, the conclusion is therefore that he is trying to create a group of people that today we would refer to as intellectuals. People who understand what's going on, and we'll talk about the details in a second. So in the content of what, or the influence that he had, and the content that he was preaching or presenting, he was certainly going in the direction of creating a group of people within those who are listening to him, being influenced by him, who today we would label as being intellectuals. We're going to see that in a second. And secondly, he played that role himself. And inshallah, we will, when we do our wrap-up, we'll see that for many of these thinkers, one of the reasons why we're talking about them is that they were not just thinkers. Many of them put in application, lived many of the teachings that they were preaching. And that's why they become even more worthy of being studied. They were not just people presenting abstract thoughts. They lived in a way that put in application, applied practically many of the things that they were preaching, and maybe many of the ideas that they were teaching, they applied them themselves. They were the intellectual they were talking about. They became that person. They were leading by example. Right? We see that in the way that they tried to influence in the world. When they said someone has to be engaged, has to be playing a political role, you have to understand your responsibility. You may agree, you may disagree, you may say that I agree with the idea, but the application was wrong. In short, when you look at it, you can see that they did not stop with words. They did not stop at the level of the words. They put that in application. They said someone has to be politically engaged, and they were politically engaged. They stood for a cause. They were activists. They did not think that it was enough to be passive with your knowledge, as we shall see, and they were not passive with their knowledge. It's not that I have knowledge and I carry it and that was enough. I reached the goal. I did what I had to do. To them, that's not enough. That's the beginning of the journey, that you acquired the knowledge. Now begins your true journey. It doesn't end here, it begins here. So in any case, in the case of Malcolm X, 1925 to 1965, he lived in the United States, and sometimes I give these details related to their lives. Unfortunately, even when you study philosophy, when you study big thinkers, I don't think that enough time is spent understanding the conditions in which these people lived and a bit of their personal lives. This has to be a part, a factor of the discussion. These are human beings we're talking about. They're not just machines. They're not objects. Human beings are affected by the conditions in which they live. Sometimes you don't really understand the idea of a thinker until you understand the conditions in which they were living. And then you understand why they came up with that idea. What problem were they trying to solve? What were they reacting to? What made them the way they are or think the way they are? And this is sometimes what gives you a lot more understanding of the greatness or not of a person. To what extent they are able to transcend the environment they're in. Sometimes the environment is very limiting, and you see that they are able to go beyond the limitations of their environment. This gives them a lot more greatness, shows that they are people who are even bigger than their time and space, right? In any case. So in the case of Malcolm X, he lived in the United States during segregation, during the civil rights movements. So of course, a lot of what he does has to do with this, has to be understood in that temporal context. What is going on politically, what is going on socially, culturally in that environment. One way to look at it is to say that he is really focused on African American Muslims, their state, their condition, their rights in that world. But when you study his, not only his thought in general, but the evolution of his thought, where he started and where he ended up, you see that his concerns are a lot bigger than just looking at the condition of the African American Muslim. He's talking about issues, he's talking about problems, challenges that go way beyond that specific class of people. He was known for defense of social justice, equality, and he had a whole journey that we're not going to go into too much, but he had a whole journey himself that he enters into Islam, but a very specific variant, form, type of Islam, and then at some point he leaves it to go to convert, as many refer to it. He converted from that to what he considered to be the mainstream Sunni Islam. And that happened after he performed the Hajj. After he went and had the experience of the Hajj himself, this opened his mind and his heart to teachings in Islam that now he experienced and he lived when he performed the Hajj, that made him think about Islam and the world in a different way. That this has to be a lot more of a global message, global teachings that affect all of humanity. And this is what I will take back. This is what I want to benefit from this religion. Not for a specific group of people living at a specific time and perhaps tainted by ideas of very limited human beings. Those who were living in the United States at that time as African Americans and so on and so forth. In any case, in his teachings or in the way that he shared his ideas with the world, he really emphasized the lived experience over what he considered to be academic scholarship. He's not someone who went to university and finished a PhD and became a professor, and that was not that important. And whether you have that or not is secondary. And he talks about this. What matters more to him, where you learn more and you have more to think about and contribute to, is based on your lived experience. What have you gone through in life? What are the experiences that you're confronted to that you have to think about and reflect on and learn from and share with the world? He considered his public speaking, activism, and moral clarity as a form of intellectual leadership. Your ideas don't or are not limited to simply the way you deliver them in a book form or in a lecture form. How do you become an activist with the activities that you perform? So in his case, public speaking, sitting in a forum where people are listening to him, being influenced by what he says, this is enough to play the role of the leader that is required by the community. He was against the idea of passive knowledge, passive and purely spiritual form of Islam, where you learn the religion and all you do with it is you keep the knowledge inside and then you use it for spiritual individual worship. He was against that, and he teaches that in his preaching, in his sermons, and so on and so forth. He advocated for alliances with non-Muslims, and that's another important point. So to what extent do I open up to others or not? That was important to him, that where there is ground to create an alliance over a common challenge that we're both trying to get through and improve a condition that we're both sharing, whether we're both from the same background or not, does not matter. So long as we have a common ground to work from, that's enough. Let's create those alliances, and this is important. Whatever goes against systemic oppression. So after Hajj, so he would have been 39 years old at that time, he converted to mainstream Sunni Islam, which broadened his vision of the Islamic brotherhood and justice. So to him, the idea of the intellectual. How does the intellectual influence in society? What is the role of the intellectual? The biggest thing that he focused on, if I were to synthesize everything that I read from him and I understand from him, starts with awareness and consciousness. He wants people to understand the world in which they're living. The better you understand it, the better you can position yourself. But this requires an effort. And so the intellectual has to be the one to go and educate and raise the awareness and make people understand what is actually going on around you. And then this can be applied specifically to issues like racial injustice. Specifically, he talks about the mechanisms of domination. What are the mechanisms that make you, as a people, as a group, as a community, ethnicity, whatever it may be, dominated? What are the mechanisms that are being used against you? What allows others to exploit you? In what way are you being exploited without even realizing? This is the role of the intellectual. That you raise the awareness of the people so that they understand all of this. The importance of resilience, that it's not going to be easy, so you have to keep at it, and the change will come, even if it may look like it's baby steps, it's incremental steps, the change will come. Resilience is required. And he emphasized two more notions that are very important that you'll see running through. He called it self-respect, but that's part and parcel of identity. Know who you are. Who are you? In a world where everything is changing around you, where identities are always shifting, where your values are always maybe changing, where are you in this? What is your identity? Do you maintain it or do you change it? Which part stays? Which part is open to being flexible? Where do you negotiate and where do you not negotiate? So he links this with self-respect. He says, know who you are and have self-respect. Respect yourself first so that others can respect you. Okay, so there's a lot here, but I'll stop so that we don't spend too much time on it. So that's the first thinker. A second thinker, Now I'll take you to the other side of the world. There's a thinker by the name of, his name is Fazlur Rahman, but he's known as Fazlur Rahman. He was born in India, but that was the time when India was being split up, and back and forth became Pakistan and India. And he worked out of Pakistan and then out of the United States for the rest of his life. He was very, very influential. He had a good, strong background in Islamic studies, but he was an academic, a university professor and an academic. And as he started to share his ideas in book form, but in his lectures and so on and so forth, when he moved to Pakistan and he was doing that type of work in universities, there was too much of a backlash from the conservative elements of the societies in which he lived, and so he left that world and moved to the United States, where he continued to teach and continued to publish his works. His works were extremely influential, and they still are until today, by the way, for people who read more academic works on Islam. Very influential thinker. He's best known for his ideas around the need to reinterpret the Holy Quran. So his focus and starting point, and I'll come back to this, his focus and starting point is the Holy Quran. How is the Quran? He talks about the Sunnah, he talks about the Hadith as well. But his main primary focus, and he is considered an expert on the Quran, and his contributions are about the interpretation of the Quran. Today, if you were to summarize, who Fazlur Rahman is, it starts with, he's a thinker who tried to apply his theories to the interpretation of the Quran. And so his main idea is that the Quran has to be interpreted in a way that meets the needs of the contemporary world. We have to rethink the way we interpret the Quran. So sometimes when some of these thinkers, their thoughts are presented and people want to disagree, they disagree with their thoughts, so they want to dismiss them, or they want to they don't want people to take their thoughts too seriously and engage with them. It's a waste of time. Don't even spend time on that. They give the impression that these thinkers are, completely outside of religion, outside of, the classic way of understanding religion, and so on and so forth. Where the truth is, many of these thinkers, they've spent a lot more time studying the Quran than many of us. Right? And so his main point and his main focus is that as a Muslim, your starting point should be the Holy Quran. We all agree on this. The only thing is, for today's world, should you be relying on the same way of understanding the Quran that they had and they were using 14 centuries ago, or should you rely on tools, on analytical means and mechanisms that are available to you today to understand this book, if you truly believe that this book is eternal, that it has all the answers? Do you want to limit yourself to the way they understood it, or do you want to open your horizon to looking at other tools that perhaps were not available to those who came before you when they were trying to understand the Quran? Those were his main ideas. And so he in general says we have to reconcile the real traditional Islamic values with modern values. But the way we do that is by knowing that there is an ethical core to Islam that can never be compromised. So long as we understand that, then we remain protected from what we use and what we bring in and what we keep outside. He was extremely critical of the education system. He says that the foundation of the Islamic education that we have in the Islamic world is the system that I don't know to what extent you are familiar with this term, but many around the world are familiar with this term, the system of the madrasa or the madrasas, right? And so he says from the very beginning the foundation is wrong. This is outdated and does not work, and it will never produce the types of people with the Islamic education we need for this type of world. We have to rethink that. So at least start to incorporate elements from modern thinking and modern education into this, if you're not going to entirely rethink that type of system. Otherwise, that system will continue to only produce failure. You have sincere intentions of reviving and reforming your societies, but you're not producing people who can do that. It will only keep producing failure if you continue to use the same education system you've always used. There is therefore a need to reform the Islamic education system by integrating secular disciplines. He emphasized the role of ijtihad. Many thinkers spent a lot of time on this notion of ijtihad. What does it truly mean? Of course, we're now thinking about philosophers, thinkers. They're not always looking at the term from a purely fiqhi sense, as we would have in our school, for instance. They're looking at it as a broader notion of thinking independently, being able to go and do your own work and your own research and reaching your own conclusions when it comes to matters of day-to-day life or matters of religion. And he connected ijtihad with ethical reasoning, which is a very important point, by the way. In advanced studies in fiqh, we always have to think about this. When you're providing the hukum, is the hukum only and limited to the technical aspect, or do you have to incorporate other aspects before you can give the ruling? And so in his case, for instance, he's saying you have to take into consideration the ethical dimension. It might be the technically correct answer, but if when you introduce the ethical dimension, it changes. Or sometimes in our fiqh we say this is from a secondary point. The primary point of view is that this is technically it's allowed, but when you introduce the secondary aspect or dimension to this situation, then you have to say it's makruh or haram, for instance. The same hukum. If you look at it by itself on its own, it's allowed. But for this type of person, it can't be. In this type of situation, it can't be, because it may lead to something else. Here you're introducing another layer, another dimension, right? This is the same thing that he's talking about. He says we have to introduce the ethical dimension to the legal aspect in our religion, especially when we use ijtihad. And here's where he goes a little bit on an attack, and he says today Islam has become stagnant because there is too much taqleed going on and not enough ijtihad going on. It's just blind imitation. We need more ijtihad. And how do we perform this ijtihad? We perform this ijtihad by reinterpreting the Quran, by opening the interpretation of the Quran to, and he says, and this is his approach and what he proposes to do, two things. We have to read the Quran, he says, focusing on two things. The first is the historical context in which it was revealed, and this is going to be a theme running through many of the thinkers. And two, focusing on the moral objectives of the religion. The point of these verses is not the specific teaching. That's what he claims and others claim like him. It's not about this or that specific teaching or this or that detail of something that happened or didn't happen or happened this way. No, there's a higher level discussion going on in the Quran that has to do with the moral objective. The Quran is trying to get you to understand the moral objective by giving you all of this. But when you may miss it unless you add the historical context. If you understand to who this was revealed, at what time in history, how did these people think, then you are allowed, and you should be, removing yourself from their historical context and now applying it to yours to see how does it change. The moral objectives remain the same. The historical context is going to change. So that's the approach that he's going to propose, and many others like him are going to propose. And that's exactly what the more conservative reading of religion rejects. If you go too far in this, it's called historicity, that it is limited by time. The verse of the Quran is limited to a specific condition and it doesn't apply to any other. Then those who believe in the more traditional way would say, perhaps, then why was it revealed as a Quran, as an eternal Quran, if what you're saying is true? You're missing a point here. And on the other side, they say, no, you're missing the point because this is an eternal message, and it can only be eternal if you know how to reapply it constantly in a novel way. You have to open up your way of understanding the Quran. In any case, you have to go through the details to understand the examples, to see how they apply it. But in short, he's very critical of how religious knowledge that comes out from all of this scripture is going to be divorced, as he says, from contemporary realities and contemporary needs if you're not able to do this type of translation into the present. So specifically when it comes to the intellectual, I have to go a bit faster so that we can finish today. So when it comes to the intellectual must engage with Islamic tradition and modern intellectual life. It cannot be one or the other. Otherwise, this is not the Muslim intellectual we're looking for. They have to know Islam very well, and they have to know modern intellectual life very well. That's one. Two, they are the ones who have the responsibility to bridge the tradition with the modern challenges of the present. The challenges of today are very different from those of the past. The tradition is what's contained in the books. You have to know how to translate one into the other to make use of it. The intellectual is the one who is equipped with, and now he's going to mention a few things. And there's going to be a lot to unpack here if we want to spend time on what he's going to say. I'm going to say a couple of words on each. But notice how he builds his structure. He says the intellectual is the one who is equipped with, first, a deep and holistic understanding of the Holy Quran. The intellectual knows the Quran inside out. That's already very impressive to say. And they have a holistic understanding of the Quran. They're not, the way they understand the Quran is not this verse in isolation of the whole Quran. That verse in isolation of the whole Quran. This verse fits somewhere into the big picture of the Quran. This is the holistic understanding of the Quran. The intellectual is the one who has a deep knowledge of the Quran and who knows how to interpret the Quran in a holistic way. You never miss the big picture of the Quran. You know how to reinterpret the detail as part of a whole. You understand how this part plays a role in the bigger picture. This is extremely important and very deep to say. That's first. Secondly, they're equipped with this one, so a deep holistic understanding of the Quran, historical consciousness. And this is going to come back. Malcolm X was talking about this, by the way. That you have awareness of history. You understand how you fit into history. Where are you today? How did you get here? As an individual, as a society. What led to you being in the condition you're in today? This is not random. There are factors that led to this. And you might think that the factors were random. They were not. A lot of this was manipulated by people who drove things in a certain way that led to this outcome. You have to have historical consciousness, awareness. You understand, if I do this, I've learned my history and the lessons of history, that I know if I do this, historically, the past 10,000 times this has been done, it has led to this consequence. But if I don't have any historical awareness, and in my mind, in my limited mind, not knowing enough about human nature individually, human nature as a society, and the trends of history, I'm going to completely miss all of that and start over. In any case, there's too much to say about history for now. The intellectual also has an ethical vision, and ethics is extremely important for Fazlur Rahman. And he talks about the importance of the intellectual knowing maqasid al-sharia, which is a huge discussion in fiqh, much more present, much more important in Sunni fiqh than Shi'i fiqh, but it is present especially today in Shi'i fiqh, whether it is called maqasid al-sharia or other titles. Maqasid al-sharia is understanding that there are general objectives and purposes behind the ahkam of fiqh, the rulings of fiqh. If you understand those higher level objectives of the religion, then you understand how the hukum of the fiqh, the ruling of the fiqh, may have to change. Because the conditions change. Because the point is not this hukum or that hukum. The point is the higher objective, what they refer to as maqasid al-sharia. The general or higher aims of religion. The general or higher aims of the sharia. What is the higher aim of the sharia? If you understand that, then you understand where this hukum fits. Because it has to lead to that. If it no longer today leads to that, then you have to change the hukum so that you have now something different leading to the same. This is the idea or the theory of maqasid al-sharia. Very, very big topic. Usually in more advanced studies in fiqh, it's discussed. And there is certainly no consensus around it. So he says, the intellectual is the one who understands all of this. So the bar is very high for someone to be an intellectual according to Fazlur Rahman. And so he says, and all of this is only possible with the modern tools. So in addition to understanding religion and having studied religion traditionally, you have to use linguistics, you have to use hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a theory of interpretation. We're not going to go into more detail now, maybe later. Okay, hermeneutics and the theory of interpretation, and you have to use history. You have to have a good grasp of history. And by the way, there's other thinkers. If we get to them today, Muhammad Arkoun, Hamid Abu Zayd, Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd, others, they're going to use the same exact logic. That's why I mention it, so that we start to see the themes around which all the thinkers come back to from different angles. They're all talking about the same thing. So these have to be part of the conclusions that we draw from this whole discussion. He talks about the importance of the intellectual being independent from the state and from any other power. They have to remain autonomous, because this is a huge problem, especially in the history of Islam. And the point of the intellectual, according to Fazlur Rahman, is that they have to be a moral reformer. Their job is not to teach people information. According to him, the main role of the intellectual is to reform the souls, is to make people become different people with a different soul. So they are moral reformers. They're affecting the morality of people. However, I need to do that. Of course, I'm going to have to use information. But the point is not to share information. It's to change the morality of the person receiving the information. So it's not just a technical expert in fiqh, for instance. That's not an intellectual. He has many works. I don't want to go through all of them. Some of them are very, very influential. I want to mention just a couple because of the ideas in them. One of them is called The Major Themes of the Quran. This is a very big book for those interested in Quranic studies. This is a very big one to know if you want to know some contemporary thinking around the Quran, where he talked about, today you might hear people talk about how there is tafsir mawdu'i, right? A thematic interpretation of the Quran. You see a theme in the Quran, and everything the Quran has said about this theme. So you're not reading the verses one after the other. You're taking out all the verses that talk about a theme to build a theory around it. This is in my understanding, this is a Quranic theory on, and you say whatever topic you are looking at. Right? This is a thematic approach. So this is what he tried to do here. He presented his way. He published this in 1980, the major themes of the Quran. But he's trying to show what are these major themes in the Quran. Okay, and so he was saying that the intellectuals can engage with the Quran through history and the social context, as opposed to just relying on the traditional interpretation. That's what he's trying to do. And of course, he linked it to modern issues, political, ethical issues. The second book, Islamic Methodology in History. Here he was talking about the evolution of fiqh and its methodology. How has Islamic fiqh evolved over time, and the tools used for fiqh and Islamic law evolved over time? And therefore, what has been the role of the intellectual throughout history in contributing to fiqh and fiqhi thinking? And he wants to show that intellectuals have played a role, even though it's not recognized in that way. And so therefore, the notion of ijtihad and coming up with your own understanding and interpretation of religion and the teachings of religion is actually dynamic and always changing. It's not static. It's not stuck in time. It must always be dynamic. And then he goes through intellectuals throughout history to see their contributions to fiqh. In the book called Revival and Reform in Islam. So this is a book that was published after his passing away. How reformist intellectuals have tried to reform Islam from within by reinterpreting Islamic teachings. So he's now presenting case studies of his theory to say, I'm not the only one talking about this. I'm presenting to you the theory behind it, but there are many before me who have actually done this in practice. I'm just explaining the theory behind it, and I'm presenting you the cases of it. And then he's also trying to show how they were met with so much resistance when they were trying to do that. We move to Muhammad Arkoun. Muhammad Arkoun, extremely influential thinker, Algerian descent or Algerian origin, born Algerian, an academic. He worked and lived in France. He spent a lot of time thinking, writing about the idea of being colonized, because France was, of course, colonizing Algeria and that whole reality. And so he is Algerian French, right? And so he's living as a true academic in France, but also as an Algerian. So very much part of the decolonization debates, France, Algeria, that relationship. And it's still ongoing until today, by the way, that whole relationship. It's not over. So he was critical of both Islamic orthodoxy, so the traditional way of doing Islam, and Western, let's call it Orientalism, and how Western thinking approaches Islam and thinks about Islam, and also how it deals with its own issues. But he's focused on that relationship of Islam and West. So he's critical of both, and he says we have to create somewhere a new way of dealing with the realities of the world. We cannot be entirely Western, and we cannot be going back to the traditional way of doing things. Do you see the same theme coming up again and again? So he says, so in one of his works, it's called Islam to Reform or Subvert, and the other, it's called The Unthought in Contemporary Islamic Thought. From these two works, he says that Islam today, as an institution, the language we use, the notions we use, the means we use, the tools we use, Islam is now frozen in time, stuck in the past. We have to undo that so that we bring it to the present. Islam is supposed to be dynamic. It's supposed to be interacting with the reality in which it lives. But Islam now has been stuck in the past, and we're not allowing it to become dynamic. It's static. It's not moving. It's stagnant. And so the way we do that is by forcing, because all of this is already part of Islam, by forcing Islam to be plural. Islam is not just the one thing that we keep hearing that it is. So he's attacking Sunni orthodoxy. He's saying that at some point in history, there is a Sunni version of Islam that became the dominant version of Islam, not leaving a lot of room for the other interpretations that were already part and parcel, part of Islam. They emerged from within, but they're not allowed to be there. And when you add all of that complexity and that richness, it gives you a lot more room to work and create interpretations that are dynamic to deal with the realities and challenges of the world. So he spends time going through the non-orthodox, non-traditional ways. So he spends time talking, for instance, about Sufism, and he mentions Shia, and he mentions others to say, see how they existed within Islam. They emerged from within Islam. They were supposed to be legitimate like all the others. But at some point they were not allowed. And that's why he says the unthought in contemporary thought. In contemporary Islamic thought, there is a part that is unthought. It never makes it into becoming a question or something you can formulate, because it's not allowed. It's not considered legitimate to have a voice, to have an opinion, to have something you can express. You're already told you're not authorized, you're not legitimate, you're not orthodoxy. You're marginal. You have to stay marginal, you're never going to be part of it. He says we have to create, allow the diversity to emerge, the plural interpretations to emerge from within, and this is going to be allowing Islam to become dynamic again and to be plural again. Okay, so that's part of the discussion. And he says a lot of the failures of all other reform movements. So we said for 2 centuries, Muslims were trying to revive and reform their religion, and they were met with, you remember we called it the Nahda and the Nakba and the Naksa and everything around that, the movements that had to do with education, the movements that had to do with nationalism, the movements that had to do with the Arabic language. Each one of them was trying to push a revival project from a different angle, and they all failed. None of them are able to say we were successful. He says the reason they were not successful is because they were using old tools. They need to use the new tools. And the new tools, he says, are history and linguistics and anthropology and philosophy and so on and so forth. The tools that we are now using in the humanities. This is what we have to use when we reinterpret Islam. This is going to allow us to make Islam, he calls it applied Islamology, a study of Islam applied. It's going to allow us to reinterpret and generate new knowledge in Islam, as opposed to constantly being in the same loop, because we use the same old mechanisms and means to analyze and to interpret this religion. And so, in any case, there's a historical critical method. It's well known in that field. And it produces the idea that, once again, the teachings in Islam are stuck in a point in history. If you don't understand that and you try to take it to a time where that no longer applies, that was for a specific context, and you try to say this is eternal, then you're going to be stuck in a loop that does not produce anything new. And it's not going to allow you to deal with the modern challenges of today. So therefore, we need to adopt a critical, interdisciplinary approach. This is what he's trying to do, applied Islamology, enabling Muslims to engage with modernity in a pluralistic way. So what does it mean for the intellectual? Specifically, about the intellectual. He says the starting point is that the Islamic world is suffering from a crisis of thought. The Islamic world is unable to produce new thought, new critical knowledge, knowledge that also can criticize the reality in which it is in. And the reason for that is religious dogma that does not allow you to think outside of a specific thing, political authoritarianism, and outdated education systems. You see how it's all the same themes that just keep coming back again and again? Those who challenge become marginalized, so they cannot really influence. And those have always been the intellectuals, he says. So historically, intellectual in Islam has meant one of three things. The ulama, so those are the religious experts. The technical experts, they are sometimes called intellectuals. You're an expert in the Arabic language. You're part of the intellectual elite. He says, but this is not intellectual because you have nothing to do with ethics or philosophy. So you're not an intellectual. And third, the ideologues. Anyone who is just serving the state or the powers. I don't care what you have to contribute. I don't care what your expertise is. If you are only serving the powers and serving the state, you're an ideologue. Those three have generally been, traditionally, historically been the intellectuals. What we need instead are people who have critical reasoning. They can criticize and say this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad. They have intellectual openness. He calls it epistemological openness, which means it's not that you're open to information. It's that you're open to using different tools to get the information. That's epistemological, right? And this is why he needs it. You have to have that if he's saying, instead of relying on the traditional sciences, I want you to rely on anthropology and I want you to rely on modern linguistics to perform this analysis. And it will get you somewhere different than if you use the same tools that have been used for the last 12 centuries. And then they have to also have, the third, they have to have an ethical responsibility. So all of them talk about the ethical responsibility. We saw in the Western thinking, this was a huge debate. Should they be engaged? Should there be ethics or not? In the Islamic world, all of them start and end with ethical, moral responsibility of the intellectual. When they reread Islam, they will, so this intellectual, when he will reread, when he will reinterpret Islamic teachings, they will challenge what is considered sacred. That's what he wants, because this will generate new questions, new thinking. They will find the unthought. There are things that should have been thought that have never been thought until now. They will find those because we've given them the room and the tools to do so, and they will create new spaces for asking what has not been asked. And this will generate the knowledge that we need. So in any case, intellectual is always going to be an ethical and political agent. So this is the engagement. And the intellectual movement that is required is never going to be the outcome or the work of an individual. He says this is generational work. At least a full generation of people have to work at it, if not more than one generation. So he gives the examples like all the universities or enough of the universities have to be engaged in this with enough journals, with enough translation efforts, with enough thinking going on to have enough mass to generate the revival or the revolution or the reform that we need. Otherwise, it will never happen. Just separate individuals trying to push is never going to lead to anything more. So Muhammad Arkoun has been extremely influential. I don't know how much you know about these other thinkers, but thinkers like Tariq Ramadan, Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd, others extremely influenced by Muhammad Arkoun, even in some of the Iranian thinkers, so Abdul Karim Surush, Muhammad Shabastari, others, they are extremely influenced by Muhammad Arkoun. He himself was influenced, by the way, because we talked about Michel Foucault earlier. He's extremely influenced by Foucault. He's just applying the ideas of Foucault. We talked about the episteme and the archaeology of knowledge, and this is all he's doing, but applying it to Islamic teachings. And there's another thinker by the name of Paul Ricard, who is in hermeneutics or interpretation theory in philosophy. So if you combine those two, apply to Islam, you get Muhammad Arkoun in any case. The third thinker, or I think we are at 3. Well, alhamdulillah, we're at 4. Okay. So it's taking a little bit longer. This one we can actually go quickly, but because I thought it's a logical conclusion from Muhammad Arkoun to mention these two because they were so influenced by Muhammad Arkoun. 2 thinkers. One of them is Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd, and the other one is Tariq Ramadan. And I think both of them deserve to be mentioned. Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd was an Egyptian scholar. He's a specialist in the Arabic language and a specialist in Quranic interpretation, and he wrote a lot about it. He wanted to apply the modern hermeneutics, so the theory of interpretation, the philosophical theory of interpretation, to Quranic studies. And this is exactly what he did. This is what he said, how the Quran should be interpreted. And so this meant that, according to him, Muslims have to re-engage with the Quran using new tools. So you see the direct influence from Muhammad Arkoun. He's about 20 years younger, even though I think they passed away at about the same year. So there's a need for a reformed reading of the Quran that focuses on the context in which the Quran was revealed, so that we know how to remove ourselves from the part that is specific, plus the humanistic interpretation. What is universal to all human beings in this message? This is the part we have to take out. Remember what Fazlur Rahman was saying? Context and ethics or morality. Same, right? Again. And he says the Quran is dynamic, not static. The Quran is, by the way, this is exactly what we find in the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. They say the Quran is alive. يجري مجرى الليل والنهار. Just like every day is different and every night is different. It may look like it's just another night and it's a copy-paste of every night is different. It's the same verse, but it has a new meaning and a new reality every day, and in every context it can be looked at from a different light. In any case, this is a huge principle of Quranic tafsir and understanding according to Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And then he is known for being a big defender of freedom of thought, freedom of belief. Why? Because we need to understand what he went through. So he says that non-intellectuals, and this is a very important point, and others had it, but he emphasized this one too. Fazlur Rahman spoke about it. I didn't want to spend too much time on it, and others too. That a non-religious intellectual, a non-religious expert, so the intellectual, is allowed to have an interpretation of religion. You don't need to be officially of the clergy to have an interpretation of religion. He made a point to write this and to say this, because this is exactly what he was confronted with. And I'll go through his personal story in a second. And so he emphasized or criticized how the clerical authority, so the authority of the ulama, those who are in clerical positions, the clergy, is too rigid. They've given themselves a monopoly over the interpretation of religion, as though a religion can only be interpreted through their means, through their mechanisms, through their tools. And so he defends pluralism and religious freedom in Muslim societies. So the story is simply that he was a professor of Arabic in the University of Cairo, and at some point in 1990 there started to be a lot more attacks against him and in his writings. And it was, of course, after some of his writings came out, they were published, he was attacked a lot more directly. You have to think Ikhwan al-Muslimin were extremely present, the conservative, very conservative way of interpreting religion, very politically active and present in Egypt. And so they went after him from all aspects, including legally. So legally they said basically that based on the law in Egypt, he had officially become murtad. He had become an apostate, and we are going to apply the rules of apostasy to him. So not only are all his works going to be banned, and he's no longer even allowed to continue working, and he has to seek openly and explicitly forgiveness and repent and say everything I said is, I no longer hold those positions, and so on and so forth. And if he refuses, he's not even allowed to remain married to his wife. And so he was officially divorced, because he's now a non-Muslim married to a Muslim woman, who's also, by the way, she was a university professor. Ibtihal Yunus, Dr. Ibtihal Yunus, she was a professor of French literature in Cairo with him. And so officially, he had to go through all of that experience. So of course, this fed into even more for him what it means to be an intellectual, what it means to have an opinion, what do I do in the face of this backlash, of these challenges, what do I do? So he left Egypt and went to live in the Netherlands in Leiden University, and she went along with him. They did not consider whatever was ruled against them to be valid. So of course they remained married, and he continued to live until he passed away a few years later. So this is at the personal level. That's why I say when we understand at the personal, some aspects of the personal details and lives of these people, we have a lot more insight into their theories and their reasoning and what they're writing about, and so on and so forth. In any case, if you will bear with me, I have 3 more thinkers. I don't think I can go through all 3. There would be too much. There is a couple that I think are worth a little bit more time, but I'm going to take your cue on it. The first one is Tariq Ramadan. He's a very contemporary thinker who has been very, very influential, especially in the French-speaking part of the Islamic world. He works mostly in French. He lived in Switzerland, France, Belgium, that area of the world. Secondly, there is Alija Izzat Begovic, who was the president of Bosnia and a huge intellectual figure, extremely influential, worth talking about as well. A little bit like Muhammad Iqbal earlier. When you have an intellectual figure who's politically active and who also becomes president and who tries to put in application some of his teachings and some of his theories. And then we have Sayyid Muhammad Naqib or Najib Al-Attas from Malaysia. And those are the 3 figures I wanted to end with. Each one of them has a few very key elements that we can focus on. They also, each of them, if we wanted to, deserve at least one, if not more, lecture. So do we stop here and continue next time, or do we go through them quickly? I give you the option. Continue or stop. One more, and we leave the 2 to next time. Yes? Okay, so let's do Tariq Ramadan, and we'll stop with Tariq Ramadan for today. So Tariq Ramadan, contemporary Islamic philosopher, lived in Europe his whole life. Born in Switzerland, he's a Swiss citizen. but he lived in a way that was entirely and fully Islamic, fully immersed as a Muslim in Western European culture. He becomes an academic, he gets his PhD, and he also goes to get his traditional Islamic studies to a certain level. The label that follows him everywhere he goes is that he is the grandson of Hassan al-Banna. Hassan al-Banna, one of the founders of Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt, considered, of course, in Europe, without any question, as being one of the main, biggest terrorist foundations groups in the world. Okay, so his sin to start with the moment he's born is that he is the grandson of Al-Hassan al-Banna. In any case, so he becomes an intellectual, he becomes a philosopher, he teaches in Western European universities, and he's extremely present in French media, especially after 9/11. And so he's incredibly well articulate, very eloquent. He's able to go head to head with the most conservative, ruthless, aggressive of those who attack Islam, who attack people simply for their belief. And he was, without contention, without competitor, one of the most vocal defenders of Islam, Islamic thinking, and so on and so forth in Europe at that time. So, what are some of his main beliefs, ideas, and theories, and so on and so forth? He believes that there is a reform that is needed in the Islamic world too. Islam requires a reform, except that the reform of Islam has to be from within. You cannot reform Islam while not knowing inside out what Islam is. And reform can only happen by those who legitimately have a voice and have expertise within Islam. Don't come from the outside as a non-Muslim and tell us how to reform our religion. What do you know about our religion so that you tell us you should change this and you should do that? This is not your field, this is not your expertise. Stay out and let us internally deal with our own expertise and our own way. We know that reform is required, and so on and so forth. And so he also talks not only about the necessity and need for reform, but what are the limitations of the reform. There are areas that you can reform, but not everything is open for reform, and not everything is open for debate. There are limits. That's first. He emphasizes the importance of dialogue, that there's constant dialogue that has to remain open. Keep in mind, his main concern is not Islam in general, it's Western Islam. It's the Muslim who lives in the West. So from that point of view, what he's raising is extremely important. You can take one of two positions. You either say, I isolate myself, and this way I stay protected, and I'm not influenced, and so on and so forth, or take the Tariq Ramadan approach, which is no, I enter into dialogue, and constantly become exposed to what is happening, think about it, reflect on it, take a position, change the position, but I am part of the society in which I live. I am not isolated from it. He's against the idea that you isolate yourself from the world in which you live. And in fact, this has multiple reasons. It's very strategic, because if you isolate yourself, it gives them a pretext and a reason to marginalize you and forget about you and decide things for you while you're not there, and they're not confronted to you as a reality, right? But that's another discussion. And so he talks about this whole idea of interfaith. What does it mean to live in a society that has a lot of faiths in it? He talks about secularism. He talks about democracy. So these are very modern notions where Islam has to take position. What does it mean for me to live in a Western society where these are very important notions, concepts, beliefs, values? How do I take position around all of those? He encourages Muslims to be present, to be active, to be vocal, to be engaged, to be opposed themselves to isolation. He talks about the idea of cultural ghettos, right? So you create a part of the city where you live your life in a way where the rest of the city doesn't know what's really going on, and they leave you alone and you leave them alone, and you have everything you need, right? You're in Chinatown, you're in Italy town, but you have everything you need there, and that becomes a cultural ghetto, right? So because usually the standard of living is lower, is poorer, so they refer to them as ghettos, but they're also referring to a cultural dimension, a religious dimension. So you're isolated, you're living in a bubble. So he says, no, we don't want the cultural ghettos. We want the Muslims to be out there, facing, interacting, in dialogue with the rest of society all the time, to be engaged in secular disciplines with Islamic ethics. So he's always encouraging, especially the youth, go into all the disciplines, just learn your Islamic ethics so you know how to apply them in every situation you're in. To act, so the intellectual has to act as a mediator between the two civilizations and the values of the two civilizations, Islam and the West. The importance of preserving, protecting Islamic identity and values. This idea of identity, very important for Tariq Ramadan. What is your identity? Who are you? What does it mean to be a Muslim, and what does it mean to be a Western Muslim, a Muslim living in the West? And these are different notions. You're just a Muslim, you happen to now be living in the West, versus you're born in the West and your life is Western. You are West, but you're also a Muslim. What does that mean? What does that look like? When they say something and it does not make you feel like you belong to it, whether it's Western or whether it's Islamic, what does that mean for you? Doesn't it mean that you have a slightly different identity? You have to figure that out for yourself. What does it mean to have this type of identity? He's against the easy dichotomies. So, just saying, for instance, it's either Islamic or Western. He says, no, it's not as simple as that. It's either secular or religious. It's either traditional or reformist. So he's against these, like, don't label it that way. Things are more complicated. There's a lot more room to maneuver than just to put it in this category or that category. So specifically for the intellectuals, they say he says they have a dual responsibility. One responsibility is towards their tradition, their religion. And one responsibility is towards the society in which they live. So they have to understand their religion or their tradition, he says. They have to preserve it, and they have to reinterpret it for their realities. And for society, they have a responsibility in society to engage with modernity in a critical way. To engage with it, understand what it means to live in a modern society, but also be critical of it where you have to be critical of it in a constructive way, so that it keeps improving. You're not being critical just to reject the whole thing. You want to be in dialogue with it so that it's constructive and it keeps improving. In constant dialogue with secularism, pluralism, and globalization. Because these are realities of the world and we have to deal with them face on or head on. Against, as we said, cultural ghettos, and we have to become the intellectuals have to become producers of meaning, not just defenders of identity. Because just defending the old identity will not always work. You have to be able to create new notions, new solutions to problems that did not exist before, realities that did not exist before. And this is only possible through ijtihad. One, so again, the same notion of ijtihad, your ability to think for yourself, autonomously, independently, plus ethical courage and resistance. Two, it's not easy to openly say, I'm not accepting whether it's coming from Islam or the West. I'm going to change, I'm going to modify to make it work. And three, with contextual awareness. You see how the same themes come back? That you have to have enough awareness of the world in which you live so that you know how to apply all of this in it. The case of Tariq Ramadan, and I will stop here end it quickly. A lot of the ideas of Tariq Ramadan, in fact all of them I think, are not new. There's nothing new in what Tariq Ramadan says. But his ability to put it all together in a synthesis that makes sense, that is relevant. It's not presented as though it's a very abstract theoretical program. Even though there's a lot of richness and depth to his thought, it's presented as something that you take and you apply. Okay, so there is philosophical rigor behind it, but there's not a lot of novelty. But he was able to take things that existed before him, to restate them in a very clear, in a very articulate in a very eloquent manner in a way that is relevant for the Muslims, especially in the West. And that's his relevance, and that's why he's important to know. He makes it a lot easier for us to understand a lot of these notions, these types of issues, than to go read some other thinkers who have talked about the same thing, but in a lot more abstract, deep, complex ways. It's as though he knows that his audience is mostly made up of people living in those cultural ghettos, right? Or teenagers and people trying to understand what is my identity living in the West, as opposed to philosophers writing for philosophers, reacting to philosophers. That would be irrelevant. We'll stop here. Inshallah, the next times that we meet, we end the discussion with the two that we did not cover, and then we start giving at least introduce the topic for the Shia thinkers, or start talking about some of them. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Questions, concerns, comments? تفضلوا.
First of all, thank you for the lecture. I had a question about first thinker that you mentioned, Malcolm X. So you mentioned that his approach to his ideas was through like a lived experience. That's how he approached his line of thinking. I'm noticing nowadays there's more of a dismissal of that sort of line of thinking, or like the anecdotal evidence is kind of looked at or looked down at, versus the empirical evidence or the academic evidence that most people in intellectual conversations are depending on. So I guess my question is, which line of thinking is more valuable? How do you determine which one is more valuable depending on what it is that you're contemplating? And how do you make sure that you have a good balance where you're not leaning one way over the other?
Excellent question. So basically the two ways of, especially in reaction to the first thinker, the two ways of, let's say, analyzing a situation and presenting a solution to it. The lived experience versus the more theoretical way of looking at things. So first, it depends on unfortunately, and that's the reality, or that's how the game is played, you have to understand the context in which you're working. So if you're trying to deal with people in the academic world, they will dismiss anything that is not academic. That they are playing in that type of game. So unless you present academic and proper academic evidence, it will not mean anything. If it doesn't come from a primary source with a thinker who falls in a certain tradition, it will be dismissed intellectually in the academic world. Outside of that, in the real world, not necessarily. So now let's talk a little bit more in the absolute and just in general, in the general sense. Of course, it should not matter, because we're about trying to understand reality and then find solutions to problems. It should not matter where we get our information. So long as it's valid and we can apply it and draw proper conclusions from it, then it's good. Right? In logic, they'll teach you, like, depending on the evidence you have, you either give an answer that is entirely within the evidence you have, which is perfectly valid, or you have to generalize and go beyond. You have to extrapolate. And when you do that, you are starting to be on risky, dangerous ground, because the case where you're applying it to may or may not apply. And so you don't know if this is valid or not, so you have to establish that this is valid. And this is a problem with the lived experience. The lived experience is always limited. So if my lived experience works and I can use it to give a valid conclusion, my lived experience is based on this community and I know this community inside out and I have lived here. When I come up with a solution to a problem we're all facing, I assure you that this solution is going to be a lot more valid than what any textbook will tell you, because you have lived experience of that specific community. And there are too many cases to list in religion and outside of religion where you see this in action. You know, a little bit of lived experience is worth 1,000,000 textbooks that become completely worthless. And as simple as when our scholars are, they say that some of our biggest scholars who had, for instance, a fatwa, entirely valid based on the textbook understanding of religion, on what to perform in certain parts of Hajj. When they went to Hajj, they immediately changed that fatwa because now they had a lived experience. As much as people would come to them and explain to them the situation there, it's a completely different thing when you go through it yourself. You don't need anyone's explanation. Now you're living it. And as you're living it, you say, okay, but this is absolutely something that requires a different solution than the one I have provided. This is what I've provided is not a solution. I have to give a different solution to this. This is a simple case, but there are dozens of these. Whatever you can rely on with lived experience, it's not to be dismissed. The issue with the lived experience or the anecdotal is more problematic. Lived means you know 100% that this happened in this way. So it's, for instance, yours. Anecdotal, it's, the story of someone through someone through someone. You may or may not be able to rely on it as it's true or not. If it's your own lived experience, it's worth its weight in gold. The issue with it is how limited it is. So, when I go through an experience, how was I feeling that day? Because the same experience on another day, maybe I would have been a lot more patient. That day I was not patient, I was nervous, I was under stress, I was distracted. The same experience that has to play in it. Or, how many times has it been replicated? It happens twice to you that it means every time. No, it's happened twice. Twice is not every time. Maybe you've done it 12 times, and those 2 times it went in a certain way. You can't say every time. Like, those are the limitations of the experience. The textbook or the more scientific literature has that advantage that at least they have to try to show that this is generalizable. So they spend a lot of time trying to establish the validity of the conclusion. And so they try as much as possible to tell you, this is the exact square in which we're playing. Inside these specific lines, I'm not looking at anything beyond. I'm just focusing on this is what they teach you when you do a master's or a PhD, right? Like you keep going. Because if you don't put that square to be very, very small, you make it big, there's too much to look at. And then they're going to say it doesn't apply. There's something here. So they force you to look at, you want to work on a theory of something? Yeah. What year are you looking at? So you're going to say, okay, I will look at the last 5 centuries. Like, no. We want years. Give me specific years from what year, because 1912 and 1913 are very different. This happened in 1912. This happened in 1913. And so which years are you going to say 1912 to, 1917? Okay. Can we make that into a square, with those timelines? Do those years make sense? Can you put them together in that way or not? And what else are you looking at? And so that's part of the rigor that you get from the academic experience. It's not only or so much the substance or the content as the analytical grid that you get. So then when you go to the lived experience, if you know, at least textbook, but it doesn't need to be. Some people have that intelligence intuitively. You know to what extent this lived experience is actually valid. You use the same analytical grid and say, yeah, this is a perfectly valid lived experience. And they use it. They do clinical studies in hospitals. They look at, the last 50 patients who came to the hospital with this type of problem, they experienced this. And okay, so this is entirely lived experience. And you are not in their shoes and you're not feeling what they're feeling. So you rely on their anecdotal evidence. But it's perfectly valid. They use that and they will go and change the whole process in the hospital because of those 50 people for one study. Right? So scientifically speaking, they rely on it too. Human beings rely on it too. This is how we live our lives. Even the people who want to reject everything that is anecdotal, look at how they live their lives. And you'll see that you cannot but rely on lived experience. Of course, it should come first. The issue with it is that it's always limited. So you have to make sure you understand what are the limitations of this lived experience. in the case of Malcolm X, even though like we're reducing and simplifying the discussion, clearly Malcolm X was an intellectual. Clearly he was very smart, and clearly he was very well informed. That information was coming from somewhere. You cannot say that this is everything that he knows is entirely based on his lived experience. It doesn't make any sense. Clearly but he wants to show that that lived experience is worth a lot, especially in his context. Black, African American, living at that time, that means something, right? Like there's a context to this that regardless of what you want to tell me, I know how I feel when you look at me or when you segregate me or when you put me in that. I don't need anything else beyond that. I know how I feel. You intended, you didn't intend. This was, there's a philosophy behind it. There isn't. The law, the Constitution, regardless of, I have my lived experience. That's enough, right? So that's the additional context in his case. And I think even though we're saying there's an emphasis on the lived experience, clearly, as I say, he was an intellectual. And anyone who understands what he's talking about will see not everything he's talking about is lived experience, right? When he talks about how powers exploit groups and marginalize them, it's not because he was all the groups or that he met with all those groups. He's studying this and thinking about it and making connections. This is textbook. This is abstract theoretical information. But he's also trying to say, but the lived experience means a lot. Don't dismiss me because I don't have a university degree. This is worthless. I have my lived experience. Right? Yeah. And I don't know if I answered the question. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.